woman's car look like it's going out for safari, but it's so cheap looking. And what's really amazing about the show is you get to see the absurdity of the shows through Exhibit's eyes because he doesn't know what's going to happen. So we're getting real reactions from him. I just love him trying to get through the day and how throughout the show it kind of feels like the people are being held hostage.
So, good afternoon. Today, in all ways and in all permutations, will be our last class. So, let me just begin by expressing my thanks. For your cooperation so far. It's been nice as far as I'm concerned. Right? And long may this continue. Now, I'd asked your class reps to share with you our new cut date. I just never thought that it would have been wise for us to combine teaching and cutting today. The more I thought about it, the more I felt uncomfortable. So it was that I just decided that why don't we do the cut on Monday? Because we still have days, firstly, but most importantly, even the extra days will not do you any harm in terms of revising for the same. Expect the cut to cover everything in the course. And we shall do it just the same way as we did the last time online. So I shall be giving the link at 1:55. So the link shall be provided at 13:55 on, when will it be? I think it will be on 25th. Right? The link which will be provided, not 15, but 13:55 hours, so that you will be ready to start the cut. At 14 hours, it will be a 1-hour cut. So 15 hours, make sure you are through. You are through with the cut. At 15 on the dot, I'll just tell the form not accept submission. So it is in your interest to ensure that you will have finished within that time, within that 1 hour at the end of the day. So today, maybe in the next 1 hour, we shall just begin and finish up this topic. Na tunaweza kuwa tumeachana that nimemaliza kazi yangu, kazi itakuwa imewabakia nyie watu wangu. So monetary and fiscal policy. The first policy topic, I guess, we are delving into. So it becomes important for us to really understand what these terms essentially do mean. Wakati tunasikia Mbadi akilia ya kuwa hakuna pesa. Lecturers have just been on strike all over the country with the, I don't know whether it is honorable or dishonorable exception of your lecturers, right? Me included. And you can see it has been a very big back and forth about them not being able or being willing to meet their end of the bargain, right? So where does he get the money to fund the budget, right? When we talk about interest rates, when we talk about things like money supply, what are they all about as concepts? You will always hear people talk about na siwatengeneze tu pesa. Why is it the case that it's not as easy as it may sound initially? In Uganda, that's what was the effect of their currency devaluation more than 50 years ago, because wananchi walikuwa na shida vile tuko na shida kama Wakenya saizi, and then when it was asked, Idi Amin wauliza shida yenu ni gani, tunataka pesa, and he just told the central government, the central bank there in Uganda, wananchi kama wako na njaa, tengeneza pesa, right? And the rest is history. The rest is history, and there's a reason as to why one Kenya shillings is worth about 30 to 35 Ugandan shillings at the end of the day. So we shall be wrestling with such issues for this policy, but just to say that these are very, very important things from an economic point of view, that you cannot talk about economics being complete absent of us discussing these twin policies of how money is collected and expended within the economy, of how money supply is regulated within an economy. But generic definition of the two is what you can see on the screen. Can just be defined as public interventionist measures aimed at influencing two economic variables, economic activities. We've been talking about economic activities since day one, literally, for purposes of achieving certain desired ends, right? What is called about tax collection? What is the optimal tax collection? There's a reason as to why we call our president Zakayo, right? That is economics. That's a nickname that maybe we economists can even claim. That is because of our discipline, and it's because of the wananchi's understanding of our discipline that is ended up being named Zakayo at the end of the day. Now, saizi yuko parliament. I don't know what he's saying. I hope what he's saying is good, but most importantly, what he'll end up doing after saying will even be better. That's my prayer. So public interventionist measures aimed at influencing the level and pattern of economic activities for the purpose of achieving certain desired goals. We'll see what these goals are, right? Now, when we come now into defining them in turn, monetary and fiscal policy will define monetary policy being about two variables, right? What is the aggregate money supply? Saizi naongea na watu, and people are actually saying that the reason as to why actually the economy is where it is because money is not circulating. Somebody was giving me a very important take that I had not considered, that ni kama pesa ikienda kwa serikali, they are not allowing it to circulate within the economy. And I think that could be right, because there's some money I normally get around this time of between last Friday and now. So you can imagine that kila wakati mimi niko kwa M-Pesa ninaangalia, ninaona na hii pesa imeingia na bado haijaingia. So I thought maybe I'll give them today, tomorrow I'll call and ask why, and I will not be surprised if I was to be told that it is a money supply issue at the end of the day. Because it's money that has to get from Egerton, it goes to Nairobi, and then from Nairobi we get our share. But sasa, I'll not be surprised to hear maybe an excuse, somebody saying that maybe Egerton has not really released that money so that we can get it at the end of the day, right? So that if you aggregate such issues across the economy, now you can get now how important this regulation of money supply becomes important. When you talk about level of interest rates, very, very important, because when you talk about even that leveling up and increasing, hopefully, economic activities, this happens, some of the factors that actually influence the same is interest rates. And there's what we call the base lending rate that is normally given by central bank, upon which banks now will leverage their interest rates depending on the risk profile of their of their clientele at the end of the day, right? So monetary policy, even before I define it formally, is just about these two: money supply and the level of interest rates. But I'll basically formally define it, as you can see on the screen. Every country, every nation, I imagine, every economy normally will have what they call a monetary authority. The agency, the government agency, which will be tasked in terms of working around these two variables: interest rates and money supply. Here in Kenya, we call it the Central Bank of Kenya. In Uganda, I believe they call it Bank of Uganda. In Tanzania, hao ni Waswahili, hao ni wangwana, wanaita yao Benki Kuu ya Tanzania. But in the US, they call it Federal Reserve. I think in England, they call it Bank of England, something like that. But regardless of these monetary authorities, their task normally will actually be revolving around the control of money supply and the level of interest rates. So they are the people who actually, or they'll be the agency that actually is tasked with the formulation, and more importantly, I cannot emphasize this enough, because in Africa, our problem in terms of execution of economic policy success is execution. Kuplan tunajuanga sana. Hiyo mimi sijawahi kuwa na shida. In fact, that's why you always hear even the people who are now successful, you'll hear a few years back they were in Africa to benchmark. You'll always hear this. Malaysia, you go to Kuala Lumpur, that is Nairobi, what Nairobi will have been had we stuck to the Nairobi master plan. I think in Saudi Arabia, their person who did for them their urban something is a Kenyan. And you look at it, you go to Riyadh, you go to Saudi Arabia, it looks so nice, right? So we've never had a problem of planning. Our problem has always been execution at the end of the day. And when well executed, monetary policy brings about an increase in economic activities. And if there's one benchmark that we can argue to actually facilitate the well-being of an economy, is that increase in economic activities. So arguably, you would want the money supply to be enough, but more importantly, the policies that are in place to be such as to encourage the circulation of this money. So you do actually wish that the leaders in central bank are very well seasoned economists, are people who are actually good leaders at the end of the day, right? And maybe some of these problems that we are having, if you ask me, is a leadership issue more than anything at the end of the day. Lakini sitaki kuingilia siasa sana, wacha tumalize course, right? Both monetary policy have these objectives. When we talk about full employment, what do we mean by full employment? We did unemployment in topic 6, I believe, last week. And if you remember, we talked about factors of production, right? And we said that it's not only labor that is employed, but we talk about also capital can be unemployed. So the intention is the full employment of the same. And also, which is the other one, even if we talk about land. But of course, by now, you know that land normally is assumed to be a given, is normally ignored in a way. But even we can argue for that it can be unemployed. And we have seen so many cases of land being unemployed here in Kenya, right? So it's always the economic objective, or any good economic policy will be seeking that these ones are fully employed, right? One of the most costliest things in any economy is if factors remain unemployed. Na ndio maana utakuta pahali ambapo kuna shida in terms of even the economic well-being is when we talk about labor being unemployed, Sasa tunaongelea vijana ambao wako hapa nje wamekosa kazi. In Kenya, I think our youth unemployment is easily between 40 and 55%, which is actually more than half of our youth being regarded as not being employed. Na hata wale wamekuwa employed, we can argue of them not being fully employed at the end of the day. So you would expect that the monetary policy, if I was somebody in central bank, or a president or a minister of finance, to actually encourage those policies that will lead to especially labor, but even more so even capital and maybe even land at the end of the day, because these are factors. Factors are inputs in the economy. So we do always wish that they are done what? Fully employed. So whether it's through encouraging some industries employing technologies that are labor intensive rather than capital intensive, right? And what do we mean by labor intensive? At least you find their majority or their technology actually employing a larger share of labor rather than capital. When we talk about these capital intensive technologies, not only are they expensive, but they end up employing very few people. As a result, you'll find actually the majority of the populace remaining unemployed at the end of the day. Mimi I don't really see eye to eye with this man called Atuoli on many issues. But there's a time some years back where he beat a table in anger and he's talked some very good economists. Akasema that if the people in Kericho are now seeking to buy tea plucking machines, meaning they are now at a point whereby they are able to dispense with the tea pluckers. So you can imagine that's a whole region that will be rendered unemployed to the extent of these companies actually going that way. I know for a fact that I have relatives actually who say, I am in Kericho, I work, I pluck the tea. I know there are people in Western who do the same. There are people in Rift Valley, even the areas where those tea plantations are, who do the same. So you can see the effect of these companies, as much as it will be a cost saver, because a tea plucker will not say, I have a headache. Ama bwana alinipiga, ama bibi alinipiga, jana. They don't have such issues. Well, ukishaweka oil, and maybe it's using fuel, there's fuel, it works, right? So they are cost savers in very, very many ways. And I think it even works better at a fraction of what you would basically pay somebody on a weekly or even on a monthly basis, right? So even when we talk about selective lending industries, how practical that is sometimes become a bit challenging, because nowadays, now you can see we are going fully towards automation. Siku hizi kuna AI. Even me, for the first time, I've started feeling my job being threatened. Maybe 10 years from now, it will be an AI machine that will be giving lectures here. We hope that and wish that it will be joking the way I joke, so that students will not find the classes as boring, right? But it's a big, big thing when you talk about economic policy, full employment. Also, when you talk about price stability, we have just learned about inflation. And I think by now you appreciate that what actually economies fear is instability or uncertainty, right? And that is what we call, if you remember what we talked about, the drawbacks or the disadvantages that accrue whenever inflation hits, that is unanticipated. And because it is unanticipated to that extent, it is not planned for. So it becomes a drag on the economy. So you always want prices to be stable. And I always say here in Kenya, I don't think we have had it as bad as other countries out here. I think it was you people, but if it was not you, or if it was you, humor me when I retell the story. right? We were in Pretoria, and we had gone there, I think, about 6 countries in Africa. And we had these people called Zimbabweans, very loud people. These people and Nigerians are in the same WhatsApp group, very, very confident. And I like that about them because it shows actually they grew up in a way that they are people who are proud of where they are. They are proud of themselves. They are proud of their identity. They are proud of their culture. And they are very, very loud anyway. People who have interacted with them, they'll tell me. But then it was a time when actually they are actually getting into what is called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is inflation pro max. And just to give you an example, I believe there's a journalist who came from Kenya, Nakakula Chapati Madondo, worth about not 10,000, not 10 million, but he ended up paying 10 billion Zimbabwean dollars for Chapati Madondo. Yeah, in Kenya, we cannot even begin to actually wrap some of these things around our heads. And it was a case whereby 1,000, you could have 1,000 this week. Next week it's worth 1 million. The next week it's worth 1 billion. And the other week. So every week the central bank will recall their notes and issue new ones with a few zeros added at the end of the day. So personally, I cannot even begin to imagine how disruptive that is. Kama ile kitu ambayo tulipitia, was it in 2022 when fuel prices went up and you were just disorganized a bit and we felt so bad. I cannot imagine how these people went through that period. And actually, we were curious enough and we asked them, how do you survive that? Because I'm imagining that if you are a pensioner, your pension is wiped off within weeks. How do you buy food? How do you even negotiate for the prices? And what they told me is that now you check yourself out of the formal economy. There is some point at which you just decide this economy is no longer working for me. I have a small plot, I have a farm. Let me plant my tomatoes, let me plant my sugars, let me plant my, what did you call that mboga? My misheveves, and let me survive because obviously I'm not able to survive in this economy at the end of the day. So it was very, very bad. And even me, I don't think I can do justice to the deleterious effects of price instability. I cannot because I have not lived it. Right? And sometimes anyway, we must be wise as Kenyans and say, hata na ile ubaya yote ambayo imefanyika, we must thank our God that at the end of the day, some of these things work roughly. Right? Some of these things work not to our perfection, but they work nevertheless. So sometimes I'm humble enough. Na ndio maana watu walisema, if you can get an opportunity to go out there, you go. It will always give you a new perspective of your country at the end of the day. And that's why I can say, I can just teach it. I have not lived it. I cannot really give the experience, but I can imagine that it is bad. It is very, very bad. The other objective will be the attainment of economic growth, right? So that the policies will be geared towards ensuring that there is a optimization of the growth in the GDP year on year, GDP growth. So whether it's a provision of cheap credit, and me personally, I was lucky enough to start working when Kibaki had just gotten into presidency. This is my 20th year of working, and I can assure you, I have a before and an after story, Kibaki. Right? In Kibaki's time, you could not really be broke because credit was everywhere and it was reasonable, cheap. It was cheap. And I wish I had the wisdom to know that hard times will come. Because sometimes I think our mind space is always such that when it's working, you think it will persist forever. Kibaki's, you could be broke in the morning and be a millionaire by this time. just by filling a few signatures here and a few forms. And you have your money and you do something with it, whatever you want to do with it. Hopefully, invest it. Most of us were not so keen to invest. We were young then, right? But you can imagine that by me getting that money, the place I normally go to take things that are slightly stronger than water, they'll make an extra sale. If I'm meaning to buy a car, that's one more car bought within the economy. If I'm willing to do some land prospecting and land buying, that's one more acreage sold, right? That's more money into people's pockets. And there's nothing as good as that in an economy. And so I'm sorry to say, that is what this government of Zakayo doesn't seem to really get at the end of the day. So zingine nadhaningi ni Zakayo mwenyewe ambaye maybe because we are told that sometimes advising him is not the easiest thing, right? But also the buck stops with him is the president. Unajua sisi hatutaki kujua wewe ni economist, vitu zikikuwa ngumu tutakulilia. And you can see actually that aspect of the government not being willing to release money. You can see counties are complaining. And you can imagine people who supplied to the government, to the counties, they are waiting for money for them to even do one or two in their lives, maybe reinvest in their companies, in their businesses. They are not able to. Okay? They are not able to because wewe kama nimenipatia kitu, maybe I even went and borrowed that money. I'm still paying for it. And I have not even gotten the gains out of that deal, out of that tender that I participated in. So economy haiwezi kuwa. Nashindwa sana watu wakisema sijui ati vitu ni mzuri. Ati ni economy inakuwa. Inakuwa kwa watu wachache sana. And you can see even how, forgive my language, but how stupid they are in terms of flaunting their wealth. How immature they are in terms of flaunting their wealth. This is not an economy where you should be happy that you are driving a Bentley. This is not an economy that should be happy. Wacha watu waone and they comment. But I would actually hate it that people will know that personally, because I got a tender worth 5 billion, now I'm able to afford a Bentley Bentiagas worth 50 million. Na inaletwa na ndege. And nimeilipia ushuru ya 5 million, which is worth actually another car, a good car to another person in Kenya, and then I'm flaunting it. There's something that I normally tell people called statecraft. Na si kila mtu yuko nayo. Why are we missing Uhuru Kenyatta? I never thought that Kenyans would miss him, not anytime soon. Right? But you can see, small thing he talked last week. Was it this week or last week? I forget. And we could say, we are comparing and we are saying maybe, hata kama kuliko kubaya si kubaya vile iko kubaya saizi. And I'm sorry to say, these are things that I can say in any forum because we are living them. You'd wish that your government will behave well, but facts are facts. Tunaangalia hivi na tunasema something is wrong somewhere. Okay. Statecraft demands that you do not flaunt. Hata kama umeweka chini ya maji, do your things chini ya maji. There are things that you do, it ends up harming rather than helping at the end of the day. Now mnasema tumeambiwa Adani, sisi wenyewe tunajua Adani ni mbaya, Mungu ni nani? Funny enough, today I had, I think, a bit of insomnia. So I was up until, I think, about 2. And that news was breaking at around 1 at night. So somebody actually was writing today that I think that even the president's speech, maybe he had wanted to justify the deals. He has to change them. Stupid people like the Uganda person Upio Wandai is even just defending the government, even today. Despite the fact there is something that is, you can say, no, maybe we'll revisit. Maybe we can even form a committee to really relook at those documents, whether this partner is who we wish. I guess pesa isha exchange hands, kila mtu ashakula yake. Nobody cares about us. I'm sorry I'm being political, but economics and politics sometimes kuna vile huwa zina marry. Maintaining equilibrium on balance of payment. Of course, when you talk about balance of payment, you're talking about this, the difference in value between exports and imports, right? So will we make sure that our economy produces goods and then we export, right? And we ensure that these goods are high value goods, so that now when we do the importation and if we compare the two, we end up with a surplus. Most of the issues that actually plague some of our economies, like here in Kenya, is because we export low value goods, we import high value goods. Siku hizi ndio najua I was scammed when I was growing up and I was being taught geography and all that, when I was being told these are our top 3 earners, and walimu used to look very excited. I don't know, coffee, tea, and what, tourism. These are very, very low value, especially as compared to what now are coming in our economy, which are high value capital goods. Right? We need machinery, we need cars, we need what? We need what? These are high value. Making, basically, with the effect that actually we are always operating at a deficit in terms of a balance of payment at the end of the day. Okay. When you talk about exchange rate stability, naonanga hii kitu hata inatu affect even in terms of inflation, because whenever the shilling is losing value, and because we are net importers as a nation, then whatever we import becomes, by the dint of the shilling losing value, more expensive to that extent. But more crucially, you want at least us to say, maybe it's size to November, if I compare the exchange rate at early this year, that variance not to be that much. Okay? Na kama lazima ikuwe that much, hopefully it will have come to our benefit. And I think this year we have done reasonably well. I don't know what gymnastics is being done in Treasury and Central Bank, but I think it's been a good year in terms of this stability. Compared to 2023, 2022, it has been reasonably okay. Right? We talk about also banks, because they deal with money, and money is tempting to everybody. Everybody wants to be a billionaire, especially if you're a Kenyan. So there's a need for a high level of regulation for our banks and other non-bank financial institutions, the circles we have, even table banking, even the groups that we have, to the extent that they deal with money, there's always a need for some regulatory framework to be imposed so as to make sure that at least the objectives are met. More critically, less debt, less complaints at the end of the day. So what are the instruments of monetary policy? Quite a number, right? When you talk about liquid asset ratio, when you talk about open market operations, when you talk about credit control, interest rate policy, exchange rate policy, CBK lending, moral suasion, prudential guidelines. So let's go through them in turn. Beginning with minimum liquid asset ratio. This is just a requirement that banks should keep some percentage, normally between 10, sometimes I always hear something like as low as 5. I think in my life I've had as high as 20, that they should keep this amount of money in liquid or liquid equivalent or near liquid equivalent. And what do we mean by money? Liquid, we're just saying that they should be in cash or near cash form. Okay. And this becomes very, very important, especially in what is called actually money creation. You literally create money, but you normally call it credit creation, whereby 1 shilling at the end of the day might actually end up doing the work of 10 shillings or even 15 shillings, depending on the minimum liquid ratio requirement, reserve requirement. Banks are normally in the business of creating money in this way, in the sense that maybe I'm not allowed to do the details. People do macro, they do it in details, but there is a way in which if I'm bank A and there's a bank B, and bank A lends somebody 1,000, and it takes it to maybe to pay a loan, 900 loan in bank B, that 900 loan can also be taken to a certain bank C, maybe an hour to come 100, bank C to bank D, if you. So that you'll find actually this 1,000, actually, if you add up these amounts, inaweza hata kufanya hata kazi ya 5,000 na nile tu 1,000 tu ambayo ilipatiwa before at the end of the day. That's what actually we in economics we call credit creation. Or sometimes you can even just think about it of money creation, because if I can actually do the work of 5,000, I have that 5,000 effectively at the end of the day. Nowadays, you even have equivalents to this like Fuliza. You have even these lending apps that are in our phones. They just basically expand credit, and in so doing, arguably create money in a sense. Right? When you talk about the what? If you hear things like treasury bills, if you hear things like treasury bonds, right? If you hear things like Eurobond, etc., these are examples of what we refer to as open market operations, a very, very crucial way in which government actually borrows from the public to finance its day-to-day operations. By now, you know government huwa ina pesa yake. All right? If they were to be asked, pesa ya government iko wapi? Hata ukienda treasury na waulize na pesa ya government iko wapi, they'll not tell you, because there isn't. Lakini through tax, right? Through raising money, through these treasury bills, enticing me that if I have 1,000 that I'm not ready to spend, that I can lend it to the government on the process that maybe 3 months or 6 months or a year from now, sometimes even a year from now, they can give me and something on top through treasury bills, through treasury bonds or euro bonds. These are what we call open market operations. Very, very interesting area. I wish I was at liberty to explain it further, but let me leave it at that. We talk about even selective credit control. In the case of even Kenya, and because we are labor-abundant economy, right? One will just think that logically it will mean that we should actually be selective to those processes that are companies and lend to companies maybe that promote the use of labor. So it will be companies that actually employ technologies that are labor intensive rather than capital intensive. Rather than capital intensive, right? So you can have that bias as an economy that us we shall only be lending to, right? If it's the case of the TTT companies, we can say wale ambao wako really who have employed technologies that actually encourage the use of labor, the abundant labor in the economy, are the people who will be encouraging banks to lend to at the end of the day. Wale ambao huwa analeta tip lacking, maybe they can borrow from outside. Right? Something like that. When you talk about interest rate policy, I believe 9th of every month, you'll always hear, I think there's normally some committee, which is called the Monetary Policy Committee, that sits in central bank and decides that for the next 130 days or so, sometimes they even give a period more than 30 days, they will decide, for example, that interest rates will either increase or decrease. or stay the same. And they'll always give some reasons for why that is the case. If you go to the CBK website, mi paka hata huwa wananitumia kwa WhatsApp. I think they have normally season bulletins. They always produce bulletins actually giving these decisions at the end of the day. People are deciding to do.
Hey, you can return for me that 300.
I'm happy they are talking economics because I've heard something like you can return for me that 300. Right? When you talk about exchange rate policy, we have seen actually this year, as I have said, being very, very successful from that point of view. Right? CBK is the lender to commercial banks. We shall see that being one of their functions at the end of the day. But sometimes the government will just come and say, please, banks, why are you hurting our people? Don't hurt them too much. Please reduce their lending. 9 times out of 10, they do not hear the government to the extent of reducing the lending. But there's also that instrument whereby sometimes the government can come and say, you banks, you are not doing well. Do something. Best practices also, right? What are the best practices in terms of monetary policy? That's also what we call prudential guidelines to guide the optimization of encouraging the economic activities within the economy at the end of the day. Right? So when you talk about monetary authorities, what are the functions? Here in Kenya, we call it the Central Bank of Kenya. I have alluded to most of them so that I'll just go through this quite quickly. When you talk about policy on money supply, policy of interest rates, right? Policies that encourage that price levels are optimal. Because tulisema ya kuwa we cannot talk about the total absence of economy. One of the reasons why I could not really understand Trump's campaign, because he always insisted of saying we shall eradicate inflation. Inflation cannot be eradicated, can only manage it, right? So we talk about the totality of this being they are the people who formulate, but more importantly, execute the government's monetary policy, right? And when we talk about such the functions that will be talking about, talk about, of course, when you talk about our foreign exchange, we'll always hear them talking about 3 or 4 months import cover. Who keeps this money? That will be the Central Bank of Kenya. They are the store. They are the repositor. Hata kama kuna pesa yote ambayo tunasema ni ya government, the banker to the government will be the central bank. Na unaona hata saizi watu wanalilia mbadi sana. The governors, I heard them threatening to shut down counties in the next 30 days because they are not happy about how Mbadi is dealing with them. Right? So he is a repositor, and I think they came to some understanding. He added them some 2 billion, I think yesterday or the day before, right? Public debt, they are the managers, they are the people who are tasked with managing and optimizing the procuring and use of public debt. So hapo ndio unasikia tulikuwa tunasema treasury bills normally will be issued by the central bank and even the bonds. And even when they go outside there, the government negotiates some loan. Normally the managers will be the central bank of Kenya. So when you talk about the types of monetary policies, what is it targeting? Is it targeting the price level? Right? Is it targeting the money supply? Is it targeting the fixed rate? Is it targeting the the exchange rate, is it targeting the standard at the end of the day, right? Bank supervision, as we said, banks must be regulated, otherwise tungekuwa tumelia wengi wetu without this regulation. And Kenya, we are not perfect, but we have perhaps been better than our whole gamut of our African brothers and sisters in terms of how successful we have been in managing this sector. They enforce what we call the Banking Act, right? And this, I think, is the legal instrument through which they're able to regulate banks. Siku tuko na vitu kama CRB, as you know. When you talk about also the best practices, the prudential guidelines, they are the people who actually use these three instruments in supervising banks. What we call the national payment system, a very, very important thing nowadays, especially. You know, nowadays you no longer talk about checks, right? You'll always hear people talking about, we talk about bank transfers, right? Both local and also regional and even international. And normally we have what we call payment and settlement schemes or systems in place to make sure that this happens. And nowadays I'm amazed because as we used to grow up knowing that if you have a check, you bank it today, you wait until almost next Thursday for you to get the amount having been reflecting in your bank account. But nowadays I'm always amazed that when I pick a check in ECON, I just take it to the KCB there. And by the time I enter my car and I drive to my place in Joro, nikuje nikunywe chai, I think within an hour or two, that money is already reflecting in my bank account. So if you think about it, and as I say, I'll be the first to say we are not perfect, but some of these things have really made things that bit more easy for people at the end of the day. So as I said, this happens both at local, regional, and even international systems. In the one that I think we use in international is called SWIFT, which is actually led by this bully called the USA. Watu wa BRICS walikuwa wanataka kuanzisha yao, sijui wamefika wapi. If you have heard about BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they must have reached somewhere in terms of bringing their payment system at the end of the day, because they wanted to rival SWIFT so that at least they can provide another alternative to these payment systems. And these transfers are very, very good. They are very, 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 very important. Wakati mnasikia kuwa at the international level, people complaining, sometimes it's actually something much to do with these payment systems at the end of the day. Na kuna siasa mingi, because as you can see, BRICS wanataka kuanza yao. Sisi tumekuwa tukitumia hii SWIFT. Maybe in the future, some banks will decide to transfer from SWIFT to whatever BRICS will be offering at the end of the day. Right? Right, as we said, it's a government banker, provides banking services to the government, to banks, non-bank financial institutions, facilitation of interbank transaction, giving loans, providing a clearance house, very, very important, right? Because if you are a KCB, if you're in KCB and your check is being taken to Standard Bank, right? Who is the intermediary that actually makes sure that at least umepata hiyo pesa? There's something that they call a clearing house, whereby what they do is that they will just collect all checks and ensure. Wakienda hapo wanasema ya kuwa tuko na 2 million as central banks and they are standard iko na 1 million yetu, so I guess they need to pay us, so we need to pay them the difference over the same, right? So also conducting external audit on banks as part of their regulatory responsibility, right? Payment system. When you talk about the transfer system, I think nowadays, if you have more than 1 million, you cannot check it anymore, right? But more or less ensuring that there's liquidity in the market, because economies normally will run on liquidity at the end of the day. Issuing of currency. And you know by now that we are in the midst of changing our currency. I think I've seen something like that on the social sphere, right? So that the people who design, they put some security features, parrot, they replace damaged currency. Na saa zingine once in a while they can come up with some commemorative currency. Maybe vile tuligonga 60 years last year. I don't know whether they did something. But I remember when we were 40 years, I think that's when we had the Kibaki's coin, right? Well, so okay. So kazi ni mingi kwao, but their main work is just those two. Money supply and interest rates. So wakishafanya hizo, we're in a good place. Are monetary policy optimal, or they have some weaknesses? Their weaknesses will actually be discussed in the context of I don't know what we call it nowadays. Nowadays, we don't call them less developed countries. Najua siku hizi kila watu wanakasirika, hasira ni mingi hapa nje. So when I was growing, what did we used to call them? Third world countries. So watu wakakasirika, ikafika mahali wakasema nao hiyo ni madharau, call us less developed. So I'm told all of a sudden that even less developed imekuwa ni madharau. I think nowadays they call them developing countries. So I guess I also need to change this to just reflect that reality that they are no longer LDCs. Let me just call them developing. Nisiwe nakasirisha mmoja wenu hapa ni mwage unga. Right? I'm getting to a point, I don't know whether it's because I'm getting old, but maybe these work things, nowadays I'm becoming quite allergic to them. Call me what you want as long as you're comfortable. You will not lose a lot of sleep over it. Right? Highly disorganized financial markets. As I said, and I always say this to my students, don't take the Kenyan example because we have one of the most developed monetary policies in Africa. So I believe some of the things that I'll talk about might not apply to Kenya because nadhani tuko mbele. I argue this. I think the countries that are in our league are just about 2 or 3 in Africa. We have South Africa, we have Egypt, at a certain level, also Nigeria. And maybe the Maghreb countries, the Moroccos of this world. But they are always favored by the fact of their proximity to Europe, right? But in some of these countries, these are very, very disorganized. Very, very disorganized. To an extent that actually the populace will fear participating in these financial markets. You'll actually hear, even when you talk about even raising capital to finance capital projects, becoming a no-no, simply because either there is no money, right? Most of these countries are coming from extended periods of war and other disturbances. And that's why I'm also even not very comfortable putting Nigeria there, because Nigeria is a very weird country. And it's a very oxymoronic country. It's a country with very bright people, but the things you hear happening there, you wonder how they even manage to keep it together. right? So they are highly disorganized from that point of view. They are actually sometimes even not developed. So the disorganization coming just from that bit that they are just not even developed in the first place. If you go to somewhere like Congo, and Congo is one of the ironies, if there were any. Kama kuna country ambayo ingekuwa imekuwa mbele sana hapa Africa, is the so-called DRC. But I always argue that maybe they have not been allowed to be what they could be at the end of the day. Right? We can talk about scarcity of viable projects and credit-worthy borrowers. Anyway, the international system has made sure that Africa or the so-called developing countries do not develop to a certain extent. I always hear that capitalism will always need underdevelopment for it to thrive. So there should be that narrative between developed and undeveloped countries must prevail for capitalism to make sense. And hata unaona saa hizi people are starting to wake up and starting to demand their rights. If you ask me, maybe there's a war brewing, and I could be wrong. In the sense of, I'll be surprised if 5 years from now, we don't have a world war equivalent in the world. Right? Because nyinyi mnaamuka, mnasema haki yenu, lakini ule bwanyenye bora anataka kuwakula na anataka kuwakura vile amezoea kuwakura. So what gives? Something must give. So there's a war coming, I believe, and I could be wrong at the end of the day. Right? Open economies, lack of faith in commercial banks, corruption, right? Rent seeking. And sometimes because we don't know any better, we use monetary policy. We target the wrong thing. Maybe we want to target inflation, but we use one targeting maybe money supply. Maybe you want to target interest rates, but you put a suboptimal policy targeting another thing. So at the end of the day, it ends up not working. And you have seen even here in Kenya, right now, we are actually having this discussion with the government. Why can't you release money? Right? You are holding so much, you are taxing me, na ile mnataka kuziweka kwa bank. Sijui wazalie interest, sijui wafanyie nini. At the end of the day, the economy suffers as a result of that. So at the end of the day, it's just, to me, I always say it's a governance issue more than anything else. Governance is just a polite way of saying we lack good leaders. It's a leadership issue at the end of the day. So the next time you say Togo Keratene, right? Make sure you are voting for your own interest. For some reason, I find it in the world nowadays, sijui ni mazinga ubwi gani zimeingia. People are voting for anything other than their self-interest. I don't know why that is the case. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, as we said, is just the way government collects taxes and uses taxes at the end of the day. How the government collects, how the government uses taxes. So when you talk about revenue collection in the form of taxes and even expenditure, right? Those are the twin pillars of what we call the fiscal policy. And they're meant to address resource allocation. They're meant to address even resource distribution. They're meant to address even what we call, when you talk about price stability in the economy. All right. And by now you realize that these are actually economic objectives at the end of the day. Right? Economics is all about how resources are brought on stream and to make sure that the mechanism of allocation is equitable at the end of the day. Right? Let me just right. So these are basically economic imperatives that fiscal policy will seek to address. Because when you collect a tax from me, you want to make sure that the person who gets it, there will be a mechanism that will justify him or her getting those shillings at the end of the day. That the person will, the way that it will be distributed in the economy, it will be distributed equitably in a fair manner so that we don't have one person becoming a billionaire while the rest of us are poor, right? When you talk about even price stability, aimed at maintaining a high and even level of economic activity. These are things I've been alluded to, and you can see them also being covered by these objectives of fiscal policy. Aggregate demand stimulation, because when you talk about economic activity, essentially what you are actually doing is to encourage the increase or maintaining an even keel of a high aggregate demand, right? And you'll see the words that have been highlighted in red, essentially being words that are at the heart of what macroeconomic objectives especially are all about. Stability in prices, full employment of factors, and when you talk about GDP, talk about encouraging optimal GDP growth at the end of the day. Right? There are three types of fiscal policy. There's what we call expansionary fiscal policy, what we call contractionary fiscal policy. There's what we call neutral fiscal policy. What are they in turn? Right? GO stands for government expenditure. T stands for taxes. Okay. And since we are talking about fiscal policy being about the collection of taxes to finance government expenditure, of course, you would imagine that an ideal being, if I collect 10 bob, I should be having a budget that is worth 10 bob. If I collect 20 bob, I should be with the aim of financing a budget worth that amount. So the ideal will be a neutral stance, whereby what I collect equates to what is spent. That's the ideal, but as we have seen, the real world is rarely ideal. The real world is anything other than ideal. So I would actually argue that the more common are these two. That your budget will be more if you are a Kenyan, especially means just kona ile siku ambayo budget yetu imeequate na taxes that we collect, right? Ndio maana hata hapo hiyo ndio inakuwa chanzo ya shida zetu mingi, right? So our fiscal policy normally is expansionary. We normally collect, I think nowadays we talk about us collecting about 2.2. Our budget is always maybe, I think this time we are talking about our budget being 4 trillion. Okay. Without even including the fact that the lecturers have come and striked and say we want more money. I think doctors are just about to join us in the next few days over the same. I think even public servants, I think, will be joining us. Ama pengine wameshaongeleshwa. I don't know. But now there is that. The net effect of that is, of course, will be to make this increase. So an expansionary fiscal policy occurs at that point whereby the expenditure normally will be more than taxes. And this is now where the imperative for loans, bonds that are secured or procured in the international market comes in, because our taxes more often than not are not enough to cover our budget. Most, if not all of the time. Right? The opposite occurs, but very rarely. And as I said, I think in Kenya, maybe if I were to stretch my mind, I think it has only occurred once in my lifetime, whereby the taxes collected was seen to be more than the government budget, the budget that has been put forth by the Ministry of Finance. It is contractually in that way that basically will ensure that there is a surplus, there is some money remaining rather than a deficit. As I said, the more common one will be if it is a neutral stance, whereby the government expenditure is just enough to fit the taxes collected by the government at the end of the day, by KRA. Okay. So what are the instruments? Of course, talk about expenditure coming out of after taxes, right? So we talk about purchases by government agencies. Here in Kenya, you've heard the word tenderpreneur. Don't know whether it's a typically Kenyan word ama ni word ambayo iko kwa English dictionary. But you can see that this is basically whereby people who are well positioned and they can take advantage of this, they make their millions or billions as a result. Because of government in most instances is regarded to be the highest consumer of goods and services in most economies, maybe with the exception of one or two that I know. But in most, the government actually is the biggest purchaser, is the biggest consumer, is the biggest demander of these goods and services. So that whether we talk about taxation, whether we talk about money printing, whether we talk about treasury bills, bonds, fiscal reserves, so zingine, if you are lucky, maybe kuna pesa ilibaki from last year. When we talk about privatization, sales of fixed assets, these are means through which governments will actually endeavor to collect revenue to finance its day-to-day activities. And even capital projects like road constructions, SGR, when you talk about also the airports, the Adanis, when you think about now what Ketraco is doing, right? And the reason as to why we are concerned is these are basically big, we're talking about billions and billions, in some cases, trillions of money being used to actually construct this infrastructure. So you just want to make sure that it's done in the best way forward. I think I talked about this taxation, government expenditure side already. Borrowing from individuals and firms, I said this is through those treasury bills, treasury bonds. If there are fiscal reserves, I've never heard about this in Kenya, but it's a possibility, especially when the fiscal policy is contractionary, meaning that you're spending less than what is coming in. There's a chance that what remains is what we are calling fiscal reserves. As I say, here in Kenya, you see every year we even have to have a supplementary budget because we realize that we still need money to finance our public right? So those are ways in which fiscal policy is brought or is realized. To tax, we expend, We print money, although it's never encouraged. The only country that actually can freely print money is actually America. And maybe that's a topic for another day, but it's because it's the biggest economy. They're able to leverage, they're able to pay their debts just through printing their money. Part of the reason being because the dollar is the world currency and people will always demand dollars. So they take that advantage to do what is called signage or printing money. They call it a very sexy name. If you are not very careful, you can think that it's a compliment. Ukienda kwa their central bank utaona wameandika printing money. They call it quantitative easing. Right? Then ukisoma economics kidogo, najua ya kuwa that's just their way of saying we are printing money. Try that in Kenya, the shilling will eat 400 bob to the dollar, or even 500, or even 1,000, who knows? Right? So it's never an option for other economies for that reason. Okay. Of course, you normally hear about privatization, and nowadays you hear even the Adani are being brought. The Adanis are being brought on stream through this process of public-private, public-private participation, PPPs, and all that. Maybe that's part privatization, but there's always that thing whereby you find maybe public companies are privatized. And of course, what is realized by the government is put into expending at the end of the day. The last thing that I want us to discuss is the principles of taxation. There are about 6, right? When you talk about taxation, what is a good taxation policy at the end of the day? And after Kenya, maybe this comes at a good time as any, because here in Kenya kumekuwa na hiyo tetesi, as you have seen for the longest, whereby we are arguing that hatuko pazuri. But Zakayo also still insists that not only should we pay, alianza na NSSF, tuka-complain, tukazoea. So unaona the last 1 or 2 months we've been talking about the CISHA. And I think these are just backhanded ways in which we are being taxed. And as much as I would wish that this money is being used well, I'm not really convinced. I'm sorry. I've lived in Kenya long enough to know the way things are. Okay. So certainty, efficiency, flexibility, economy, and equity and convenience, right? So let's begin with equity. Equity just means fairness, right? That a good tax policy should be equitable, should be fair. The import of this is that it's normally pegged on the taxpayer's ability to pay, right? So you earn more, you pay more. You earn less, you pay less to nothing. Because I think here in Kenya, I think anybody who is earning less than 25,000, they normally are exempted from tax payment, right? So here in Kenya, we have what we call a progressive rather than a regressive taxation policy. Progressive simply means the more you have, the more you pay. The less you have, the less you pay. Of course, here in Kenya, because of corruption, we find that there are people who, the well-connected, maybe end up even paying a lower tax rate than those who are basically paying or earning less than them. But that can put it down to corruption. If the law is to be followed to the letter, we still have what we call progressive taxation. The more you have, the more you are expected to pay. A tax policy should be easy to administer, should be economical, right? Cheap to collect Meaning that KRA should not tell us that they'll be collecting, how much do they collect? Is it 2.5 trillion? And then they say that half of it, maybe 1.3 trillion, will go towards funding their operations. Right? That is what that means. That KRA should actually be using the least resources to collect the most amount of taxes in Kenya. That's what we mean by the need for it to be economical. Should be convenient, right? They also has to encourage more payment of taxes. And you can see that here in Kenya, it is so convenient that even before I earn, that money is already not there. Kuna siku ambayo washaniambia kuwa wewe tumekupatia pesa yako ya tax, fikiria kama utalipa ama hautalipa, right? It is very, very convenient that way. But also there are these taxes that you are always, apart from payee, whereby you pay out of some money. Maybe you have a business, you're paying VAT, maybe you're paying some excise tax, you're paying some business tax. Normally KRA would wish that the process of you paying that is as convenient to you as possible. So as basically not to have that excuse that you didn't pay maybe because you didn't understand or you didn't do one or two. Should be that you are able to pay. Should be efficient. Tax policy normally are put in place to achieve many things, right? They have an aim. Hata kama ni ile ya kupatiana leave service, they normally have an aim. So at the end of the day, there is always a process whereby it is determined whether those aims have been met, those objectives have been met or not. Has it achieved its intended aim or not? Right? And kuna hii ujinga ambayo huwa nimeona, and I saw this even when I was very, very young. My dad, as it were, he studied in America. And him studying in America, I used to have these publications from America. And I used to read them, and I used to hear something like trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics meaning that if you have a billionaire, they normally say that hakuna haja ya huyu billionaire alipe tax mingi. Mulipishe tu tax kidogo, so that whatever is remaining out of that, he can invest it to employ more people, buy more capital goods, right? Expand his company, etc., etc. But does that happen? Can you imagine that time I was in primary, but I think I was old enough to know that man will not necessarily subscribe to that way of thinking. That we assume that these billionaires are so good that, imagine somebody like Elon Musk. I think between July and October alikuwa anasema alitengeneza $40 billion. This is a third of our GDP being made by one person, right? Sasa pengine alikuwa kwa lipe 30%, that is 12 billion. Mnasema ya kuwa wacha tu alipe 6 billion. With the rider that maybe 6 billion tumemhurumia, he can go to basically invest in the company. Rarely happens. Hii 6 billion ataenda tu ajifanye tu to be even more richer than he is. Maybe he'll spend it to buy a yacht, to buy more houses. I'll not talk about cars because I always assume that once you are a billionaire, especially in dollar terms, you've bought all the cars you can afford. So it's no longer an issue. But you can see that way of thinking. So this trickle-down economics is something that over time, I'm happy that even when I was young, I could think like an economist, and I was right, because the proof has always been that doesn't happen, that you expect this money to trickle down to the hustler. It rarely does, if at all. This billionaire will always seek to sack people. Na mliona Elon Musk, when he bought Twitter, he sacked more than 70% of the workers. So a company that had almost 8,000 employees, within 1 year had only about 2,500. So their mindset is different from ours, and we must accept that to be the case. There are not people who will say that ukimhurumia hiyo tax ataongeza watu bishahara. No, it rarely happens. Should be flexible, right? Should be flexible. And what we mean by flexible, should not be too difficult to change its structure. And normally, taxes normally are administered via some tax rate, which is a percentage. So easy to calculate. Hata wewe unaweza tu kujicalculatea. Na wakati government inataka kuiongeza, they'll just add the percentage points, they recalculate, and you'll see the difference by which you owe. So it should not be flexible. You should not need calculus to calculate your tax rate. No. It should be something that can be easily calculated. It can be understood by the vast majority of people. And even the government, should it reach a point whereby it is willing and able, or maybe there's a need for it to increase the tax rate, it should just be something as easy as them just coming out, changing the algorithm, the percentage, and then you are able to calculate the new tax rate at the end of the day. Right? Fiscal policies are good, but they are limited. And normally we have what is called the unintended effects of fiscal policy. And they are normally divided into two. There's what we call the crowding out effect, and there's what we call lags. So if I begin with the crowding out effect, what it simply means is governments, there's always this preference to lend to governments. If you go to the bank and if you wish to get a loan, and the government comes the same time and requests a loan, the government will be given that loan very fast. Because ceteris paribus, it's normally assumed the government can never default. It's normally assumed. It's normally always taken as an article of faith. Like any squeezes in a default. Ghana defaulted, I think 2 years ago, with very, very bad consequence on their population. We imagine uko na 40,000 kwa M-Pesa, kesho ukiamuka unaambiwa uko na 28,000, 12,000 government imeuma. You'll always hear Jimmy Wanjigi talking about something called a haircut. That's what happened in Ghana 2 years ago. You go to your bank, you realize that if you had 100,000, you only have 80,000. Naambiwa ya juu, because the government is sovereign, and you and me are the sovereign, wakati government imedefault hivi, wewe ndio utalipia hiyo loan. Okay? So because of this preference, you'll always find actually the private sector being crowded out of the lending market by the government. And that is basically what we call the crowding out effect. The government's appetite to basically purchase treasury bills and bonds. And actually the people who buy these treasury bills and bonds are financial institutions like banks, pension schemes, right? SACCOs and all that. So our interest rates rise simply because of that. Me, I'm a part of the private sector. So because I want a loan and because the government has come in, you'll always find me being crowded out. Now, come here, I'll insist on getting that loan. I'll be giving it, but at a reasonably higher interest rate than if the government was not going for those loans. When I began work those 20 years ago, actually, I remember I used to see people coming and actually begging us to take loans. For the first 2 years, for the first actually more than 2 years, almost 3 years, 2.5, at least I can guarantee that. Because I remember I held out for 2.5 years before I took my first loan, right? But every time, every week I could be in the office, somebody could come in, oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm from Barclays. We have these products. I have not seen them around for the last 18 years or so. At some point they stopped because Kibaki alianza vizuri akasema will not go to the banks to get money. We'll get our money, either we'll finance, we'll seal all tax loopholes, we'll go to the international sector. But at some point, I think they fell to the old adage because they are the people who own these banks. So I don't think they could hold out for very, very long. They needed these people to finance them. I think when they were fighting Raila at some point. So the quid pro quo was, come back, buy these treasury bills or sell these treasury bills to us. So the interest rate started coming up. But those days, as I tell you, they were good days because we could get loans and cheap loans. As I tell you, Papa Zulu could wake up broke, and by now, I've done 103. I have 1 million or two in the bank. Something that right now cannot really happen. Or if it has to happen, I'll have to really move mountains, literally, for that to happen. So there is that what thing we call, which is an unintended effect, a negative effect, because when you talk about even this money circulation, when you talk about maintaining a high and even keel of economic activity, this actually limits the effectiveness on fiscal policy in enabling that, because you've already crowded out Nyanjong, you've already crowded out the hardware person, you've already crowded out Mama Mboga, you've already crowded out all hustlers in the economy. So because money is not flowing, we cannot spend. If we cannot spend, economic activities will decrease to that extent because we've simply been crowded out because of the government appetite for money. The next thing is lags. Lags basically happen simply because you can put in place a policy today, but its effectiveness will be observed, if at all, weeks, months, hopefully not, but sometimes years later. Na pengine ile shari ambayo hiyo policy ilikuwa inatakikana iadress inakuwa tayari ishapita. Right? So there is normally that mismatch between putting in place a policy and it kicking in terms of you actually even seeing the effectiveness and even being at the point at which you can analyze whether it works or not. So those policy lags sometimes have that effect of reducing the effectiveness of this fiscal policy to that extent. Kama ingekuwa kitu unaweka leo, kesho unaona matokeo, it's much, much better. And you can actually course correct if it must come to that. But kwa sababu hautajua the effectiveness immediately, sometimes by the time you realize that it's not working, the damage is already accelerated, or maybe hiyo shari inakuwa imepita. So maybe you will have been much better not even putting the policy in place in the first place. So I can see nothing in chat. I can see nothing in what? In terms of raised hands, what remains is to thank you. For those who are not with me earlier, I had announced this, but I'd also told your class reps to to announce to you. That will be on Monday, I believe 25th November. Link will be provided at 5 minutes to 2. So at 13:55 hours, I shall be providing the link. Cut is 1 hour. At 15 hours, I close the link. Kama utakuwa umeachwa nje, I'm not be entertaining any call that you wish to be admitted for makeup or anything. These cards are very hard to construct at the initial level. I can assure you. Najua kati inakuwa trade off. Hii ya rahisi ambayo mnafanya kwa class, saizi ndio malecturers wenzangu wanalia. Because now they have to mark. And you can imagine you people, you are almost 200. I also have other 600 students. So it's not very, very easy for them. Lakini mimi ninalia when now I am constructing the cut, because it normally takes a lot of time to come up with the questions. So it's not something that I look forward to, and don't take it for granted that, lecturer atanipatia makeup cut. You really need a damn good reason for me to even begin to entertain the possibility that I shall offer a cut. So class reps, if there is anybody who is not nini, I don't want to get letter. Me, I don't entertain letter stories at all, who you are, unless you have a genuine thing, maybe you fell sick on the day or something. But that also you'll need to provide evidence that you indeed were unwell. Otherwise, I'll not entertain it. So we'll do it on Monday. We were supposed to do it today, as we said, but the wisdom that had gathered, I said, kuna haja ya tufanye na at the same time tufunze. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's better to tufunze, siku ya kati kuwe siku ya kati. So as I said, thank you guys very much. You've been good. I can see we're about 33 of us. I think we went to a high of 44. I'm wondering where the other ones are. So I hope they are taking their due care to make sure. Somebody is talking about lecturer evaluation. I've engaged my chair on the same. Hii ndio wakati ninasikia lecturer evaluation. So I don't know what's happening, but I engaged the chair at least today. I want to believe that he's doing something about it. I'll engage him also, maybe tomorrow, and see how far he has gone to. But he insists of the matter of the evaluation. And I think I asked one of you, whom I must thank, Joseph, also brought it to my attention. What I'll do is just to follow up so that at the end of the day, you are at a point whereby you are able, maybe by Monday, takuwa nimepata suluhu, and I'll communicate to your class reps as the case may be. So don't worry about it too much. It should work one way or another by maybe latest Monday, hoping even as early as tomorrow. So thank you, Lorraine Kaveke. Think about that. I read that Lorraine as a Turkana name, but I can see it's an English name. Right? I initially read it as I thought it was a Turkana name or something. So you guys have a blast. Read everything for the cut. The cut is comprehensive. Hiyo nisiwadanganye. Hivyo I'm hoping that mmekuwa mkisoma, but it's not too late. You can read and at least get something, and also the exam. Kama umekuwa ukiattend class, kama umekuwa ukinini, you should have no problem with my exams. Because I've just said what I have taught, and that is that. I've not done anything outside of that which I have said. And you have the resources, you have the resource book, you have the slides. Hopefully you've been attending classes. Your class, for some reason, you've not been asking questions. I don't know why. Lakini naonanga kuna hii kasumba ya watu kusema me, I'm not an economist. Mimi hapo ni mpita njia tu. Sasa sijui kama hiyo ndio imekuwa attitude, which is okay, but I can assure you that once you stick to those resources that I've given, should be more than qualified to at least get a 39.5 out of 100. That one can be assured. So thank you very much, guys. You've been good. Thank you for your patience. I'm suspecting I will not be there for the exam because I should be attending some conference in Mombasa, but I shall make sure that you are more than catered for the same. So thank you very much. Have a good day.